Thank you, Professor Gobbridge, for having me, and thank you to the center for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly since your weather is so nice. We're already starting to really cool down on the East Coast, so it's nice to be here. I'm going to talk about the sectarian apocalypse online today because, like most avant-garde researchers, I'm doing a lot of research on Twitter these days. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is drawn from that social media venue. But this topic is pretty timely because of the nature of the conflict in the Middle East. And I want to suggest in this talk that the location of the current conflict and its violence kind of lends itself to apocalyptic thinking. The early Islamic traditions about the apocalypse are an inviting source for justifying one side in the conflict. Just as a brief primer, if you've never studied apocalyptic literature, just to give you a sense for the kind of functions that it performs. First, apocalyptic literature can help orient a person in time and space. So a lot of different religious traditions have apocalyptic literature, often as part of their scripture, and it can give a person a sense of where they fit in into larger history. They can also help explain events. Apocalypses there's often a sequence of things that will happen that lead up to the end of days. And there are various actors that involved, and if you can map these actors onto contemporary actors in politics, then you can help explain what is happening in the world. Apocalyptic literature, perhaps counterintuitively, can also be a source of consolation. If your world is falling apart, it can give it meaning. It can help make sense of the horrible suffering that you and your family and your community are undergoing. And then finally, apocalyptic literature can actually motivate people to action. And that's something I'll come to at the end of the talk. So, here's a brief, very brief introduction to Islamic apocalyptic literature, if you haven't looked at it before. Most of Muslim thinking about the apocalypse doesn't actually come from the Quran. There's a few allusions in the Quran to the end of days. There's a few symbols that are mentioned, a horn that will be blown. There's a hint that Jesus will return, but there's not much in there to really flesh it out. We just know that from the Quran that there is going to be a final hour and a day of judgment when people will be called to an accounting, but there's not a lot there. Most of it comes from the hadith or records of Muhammad's sayings or doings or the sayings or practices of his companions. This is a vast literature. There are many, many collections of hadith. There's a Sunni version of the hadith, there's a Shia version of the hadith, and it is books and books and books of material. A lot of the apocalyptic literature is found in these collections. And as you can imagine, a lot of it would be contradictory just by virtue of having such a large amount of material. You're going to have a lot of contradictions, and this material is extremely contradictory. And the modern masters of the apocalypse, the people who can write about it with great fluency and sophistication, are the ones who are really good at kind of parsing out and explaining away the contradictions between the various images and events. The important thing for us to keep in mind, and leads to the main point of the talk, is that a lot of this apocalyptic literature arises out of the political turmoil of early Islam. That's really where it comes from. There are a series of what are called tribulations or trials, fitan, that occur in early Islam and that divide the community. It's really a series of civil wars to see who will lead the community. And out of these conflicts over leadership, which occur very soon after the death of Muhammad, this literature is generated. Some of it is created as predictions of things that will happen, hopes that people have. A lot of it is written after the fact in order to justify a loss on one side of a conflict, or conversely, a victory on one side of the conflict. And very often this literature is put into the mouth of Muhammad. So you have a lot of these sayings of Muhammad about the end times that reflect political realities and political turmoil on the ground. And in fact, it's a very rich literature to mine, and some scholars have started to do so to get a sense for the anxieties of the time period and the various political factions. You have a lot of place names that will resonate with contemporary place names. You have a mention of the Yemen down in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. You have mention of Iraq. You have mention of al-Sham, which we'll talk about in greater detail in a minute, but basically the eastern Mediterranean coast. You have a number of actors that you may not be familiar with. Jesus is in there, so you've heard of Jesus. The Mahdi, who is a savior figure, it means the rightly guiding one. Dajjal, which is an Arabic word that means a deceiver, and he's often called al-Masih al-Dajjal, or the deceiving Messiah, the Antichrist. You have a figure that we're going to talk about in depth called the Sufyani. You also have mention of Rome, which was the name for the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia. You also have mention of the Turks. You also have a number of symbols that are mentioned. You'll find a lot about black flags, which we'll talk about, and yellow flags. You also have mention of white minarets, which I'll come back to. But the point is, by its nature, this apocalyptic literature is very sectarian. It was generated because of sectarian conflicts, and it is used to justify one side's position or another. And a lot of the events that are described in the literature presume that the fighting at the end of days will primarily be not between Muslims and infidels, but between Muslims and Muslims. It's a long series of bloodletting in the Muslim community that leads up to a final confrontation with the infidels and an eventual victory of Islam. So I want to focus on three things so you can get a sense for how this sectarian apocalyptic literature resonates today with today's conflict. First, I'm going to talk about a place, al-Sham, an actor, the Sufyani, and then a symbol, the black and yellow flags. First, you look at al-Sham, which is this area along the eastern Mediterranean. This is how the medieval geographers conceived of it. So it includes everything from part of the Sinai up through Palestine, going up through today's Syria, going up into parts of Turkey. So it's that whole area. Now, if you look at the Sunni writings about al-Sham, there is a lot of praise for the land as the location of the great final battle with the infidel. And you will find a lot of traditions about how that there's going to be a hard core of virtuous Muslims who are going to continue the fight until the final days. And when the Mahdi appears and Jesus appears, they're going to gather together and fight this great last battle against the infidels. A lot of this literature in the Sunni tradition comes from the civil wars that were raging in this geographical area. The Shia hadiths, on the other hand, about al-Sham, they mention al-Sham as a place for an apocalyptic battle, but they don't often praise the land for that reason. Rather, this is where one of the main enemies of the Shia is going to arise. So unlike the Sunnis, the Shia writing about al-Sham tends to be almost universally negative, whereas for the Sunnis, it's more of a mixed, if not a positive view.
So let's look at some of these prophecies, and then we'll see how they're playing out today in today's conflict. So one famous prophecy is that the prophet tells his followers that when the final hour is approaching, to go to al-Sham. That should be the first place that all pious Muslims should go to engage in the final battle. And if they can't go there, they should go to Yemen next. Another one that's quite popular says, "A party of my community shall not cease to fight at the gates of Damascus and its surroundings, and at the gates of Beit al-Maqdis," which is Jerusalem, and its surroundings. And then it talks about that some portion of them are going to split off, but this is that saved group that is going to keep the flame alive until the very end. But importantly, they are to go and fight at Damascus and Jerusalem. You can see a lot of this popping up online if you were to Google around, do a word search on Twitter for the various terms. You would see that a lot of the results that pop up are coming from Sunnis. And I have tried to, where I could, mention where they're from, but I've translated some of these for you. This one says, "Those who read about the signs of the hour know that we are at the end. The battles of al-Sham will end and the confrontation with Rome will begin. This is no time for luxury and opulence. It is a time for seriousness and preparation." Another says, "The encirclement of al-Sham is imminent, which is one of the signs of the hour. God knows best. Al-Sham is boiling. The beginnings of the signs of the great hour are at the door. And the time of the great battle draws close. It seems the Mahdi might be lingering among us? Question mark. By God, this is from the heart. The fitnas, or these tribulations, are multiplying, and the signs of the hour are drawing close, especially the corruption of al-Sham and the approaching appearance of the Dajjal, or this Antichrist figure." The preceding tweets are just from some dudes on Twitter. I mean, they don't really rate. They have a couple of followers. But this isn't just an exercise by the nameless masses. You also have major clerics who weigh in on this stuff, big-time religious scholars. One of them is Muhammad al-Arifi, who is probably the most popular Sunni religious scholar on Twitter. He has something like 4 million followers. But sometimes he engages in this kind of apocalyptic theorizing about where we are in the timetable in the march to the final hour. Another hadith or prophecy that you often see, it talks about the descent of Jesus from the white minaret. The tradition goes, God will send the Messiah, the son of Maryam, who will descend at the white minaret at the east of Damascus. And most Sunnis think that this is part of the Umayyad mosque in Damascus. And that is the particular minaret that the hadith is talking about. So they expect that Jesus will descend from this minaret to take part in the final battle. This is the logo of Nusra's press wing, its publication arm. It's called Al-Manara al-Bayda, or the White Minaret, and it's an allusion to that particular hadith. Another one says the Muslims' place of assembly on the day of the great battle will be in Al-Ghuta, near a city called Damascus, one of the best cities in Syria. For those of you that haven't followed the conflict in Syria, Ghuta is this green fertile plain that surrounds Damascus on the east and the south. It's where a lot of the heaviest fighting has been taking place. And you'll remember last year, it's where the chemical weapons attack took place. So this area itself is really steeped in apocalyptic tradition. Here's one tweet about it. The Muslims' place of assembly on the day of the great battle will be in Al-Ghuta. This is Al-Ghuta. This is the land that is watered with the blood of its youth. Another really popular tradition right now concerns a teeny tiny town called Dabiq. Dabiq is this little village, that's it there, just to the north of Aleppo, about 20-25 kilometers outside of town, really part of greater Aleppo. But it figures in one of these important prophecies of the end times that you find in one of the major Sunni tradition collections. And it says, the hour will not come until the Romans land at al-Amaq, which is a plain further north of Dabiq, or in Dabiq. An army consisting of the best soldiers of the people on earth at that time will come from Medina to oppose them. And then they're going to arrange themselves in ranks and fight one another. In short, this is where the Romans, which many Sunnis interpret as the West, is going to have its final major showdown with Muslims. This is where the great battle is going to take place, in this tiny, tiny plain where the city of Dabiq sits on. There has been a lot of fighting around this city recently. It is actually not that strategically important, but it is incredibly important to the Islamic State, so much so that they named their own English language periodical Dabiq. And they have an editorial introducing the periodical, explaining where the name comes from. They give the tradition. And there's been a lot of, if you look at ISIS Twitter accounts, they've been tweeting a lot about Dabiq. There's a hashtag devoted to it. They took the city with quite a bit of fighting in August, and they've stationed their guns on the tiny hill overlooking the city. It's not strategically important, but it's very important for the Islamic State, which is driven in some measure by these prophecies of the end times. So you've had a number of tweets of people taking sort of, I guess, flag selfies overlooking the town since they took it in August. Another part of this prophecy that you see being really played up now since the summer is that when the Romans come to confront the Muslims in the final battles, that they are going to be gathered under 80 flags. And so this is connected, interpreters on Twitter will connect this with the Dabiq prophecy and say that, you know, the 80 flags are gathering, they're getting ready to go to Dabiq. So when the United States decided it was going to carry out strikes inside of Syria, the speculation went rampant about how many nations are joining up. And so there's been a count every time another nation kind of volunteers its support, whether it's in material or just good wishes, they're added to the list. So they're counting up to 80 because they anticipate that this is going to be part of the force in the last battle. Okay, so that's for the Sunnis. The al-Sham is even though it's going to be a scene of horror and violence for the apocalypse, it's also the place you want to be. It's where the action is going to be. It's where the faithful are going to gather in this final battle, and you want to be in their ranks and participating. The Shia have a different view of Syria, a darker view of Syria, because that's where one of their main enemies is going to come from, and it's this enigmatic figure called the Sufyani. So the Sufyani, and I'll give this by way of background and help explain the liver eater comment up there. So during Muhammad's lifetime, his main opponent was the head of the Quraysh tribe, a guy named Abu Sufyan. One of his most implacable enemies. And it is even said that his wife, a woman named Hind, after a battle, ate the liver of one of Muhammad's uncles. Now, this family eventually converted to Islam, and their son, a fellow by the name of Muawiyah, ends up fighting Muhammad's son-in-law for control of the nascent Islamic State. And ends up displacing Muhammad's grandsons and establishing the Umayyad Caliphate, named after one of his ancestors. So he's the son of this Abu Sufyan. And this dynasty has a mixed view among Sunnis. Among Shia, it's universally condemned as people who wrongfully usurped the family of the Prophet for leadership of the Muslim community. For the Sunnis, it's a lot more complicated. Some Sunnis, in fact, have quite a favorable view of the Umayyad dynasty, don't view them as usurpers, and also have a favorable view of their descendants. And so there is a major conflict that breaks out between supporters of the Prophet's descendants, or his immediate family, and this Umayyad dynasty. And because of this conflict, there's a lot of prophecies that are generated as a consequence. For people who are pro the Umayyads, they have their own prophecies. People who are anti-Umayyad have their own prophecies. And out of this civil war comes a huge body of literature about the Sufyani, this person who is descended from this Abu Sufyan fellow, whose son founded the Umayyad dynasty. And depending on where you fall on that conflict, you either think the Sufyani is a good guy or a bad guy. For the Shia, he is a bad guy, this figure, who is going to appear at the end of time, and he is going to once again persecute other Muslims, and then the Mahdi is going to have to arise and to put him down. For the Sunnis, they have some of that, those traditions of the Sufyani being a bad guy. They also have traditions of the Sufyani being a good guy, as kind of a national hero, particularly for Syrians. And in fact, someone claiming descent from this Sufyanid line established himself as the ruler of Syria for a few months and claimed to be the Sufyani. The reason why this, without going into a lot of detail, but the reason why the Sunnis have a more mixed view is that by their nature, the Sunnis tended to be more Iranic. They were trying to overcome, as a religious movement, all of these fissures in the early Islamic community, whereas the Shia were sticking more with their line that it should have been the Prophet's family who ruled. So that's why the Sunnis have a more mixed view. For the Shia, it's pretty clear. This guy is a bad guy. So you have him appearing in canonical Shi'i collections of hadith. He also makes an appearance in lesser collections of hadith, but he's all through the literature. And so you have a lot of talk about him online from the Shia, who connect him with the current conflict in Syria, and they are looking for him to appear in Syria, and they're trying to identify who he could be because they feel that the current conflict must mean that this figure is going to arise. So this fellow says, a question deserving contemplation. We know from the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, the Shia, that the Sufyani will manifest before the appearance of the Imam Mahdi and attack the people of Syria. This is the head of Iraqi Hezbollah, not the one in Lebanon. But he says, all of us believe the Sufyani will fight the Imam, and the Prophet will kill him in the land of al-Sham, or Syria. We want to stress that what is happening in al-Sham is the beginning of the fitna, or this tribulation, and is the beginning of the appearance of the army of the Sufyani, which is now called the Free Army. So they look at the Free Syrian Army, the Shia do, and see this as the Sufyani's army. Here's another one. In a series of 3 tweets, he lays out a timeline for the appearance of the Sufyani. So he says, I will review for you some of what is happening in the land of al-Sham before the appearance of the Imam Mahdi. One is the presence of a general trial or tribulation among the Muslims, and Rome and the Turks will control them. And Rome and the Turks, he says, means the Westerners and the Russians. I don't know how the Russians become the Turks, but these guys don't get bogged down in details. Number 2 is the presence of a specific civil war in the land of al-Sham, which causes differences, weaknesses, and economic loss. And then finally, there's going to be a series of 3 leaders. 2 of them are really obscure in the tradition, but there's the Sufyani again, and he will triumph and control Syria and Jordan, and that's the time when the Mahdi is going to come out and fight him. You get even more elaborate stuff if you were to look on YouTube. I won't play it for you here, but this is a 10-15 minute video, and the guy's got full-on graphics of all the armies moving everywhere and who is fighting whom. It's pretty spectacular. The upshot is, for this particular person who is Shi'i, the Sufyani, this demonic figure, he says is Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. The group flying the black flag, he says, is the Sufyani. And so the Mahdi, this savior figure, is going to come out soon. Here's another one. It talks about, now this is more contemporary. I got this a few days ago. He asks, is the entry of America to strike ISIS in Syria the beginning of the appearance of the Sufyani and the creation of his crisis in al-Sham? Now, if you were to go on the flip side, I don't see the Sunnis talking a lot about the Sufyani, but when they do, sometimes it's quite positive because, again, they have a much more ambivalent view towards this figure. And if you're Syrian, you often have a positive view because he's seen as a national hero. He's descended from this dynasty that ruled from Damascus. And so his return would be a good thing. So this is a YouTube video by Adnan al-Arur, who is one of the leading religious scholars for the Sunni rebellion. He lives in Saudi Arabia. He's quite popular among all the Sunni rebels, not just the more extremist element. And he says in this, God willing, all of us will be in the army of the Sufyani, who will appear in Syria by the permission of God. All right, now we get to the third and final example of these various sectarian readings. We come to the symbol of flags, in particular black and yellow flags. So if you're to read Islamic apocalyptic literature, you would find that there are a lot of flags in there. Sometimes there's white flags, sometimes there's red flags. You're going to find a ton of black flags. And then there's mention of some yellow flags. This, again, has to do with these early civil wars. This group that rebelled against the Umayyads in Syria and eventually overthrew them built their army in the east, in what is today Iran, Afghanistan, and they raised a black flag of rebellion and overthrew the Umayyad dynasty. And so that the black flag then has come to have a lot of apocalyptic symbolism attached to it. But it's not uniformly good, as we will see either, because some interpret it in negative ways depending on their perspective, and in some surprising ways. So I found this fascinating. The Shia have a very strong claim to the black flag. When there are Shia millenarian movements in the past, they will often raise the black flag as a sign of revolt. But it's difficult to claim it in this current context because, of course, that's the flag we associate in our minds with the Islamic State or with Nusra, the al-Qaeda branch inside of Syria. So instead, a lot of Shia have focused on the yellow flags that are mentioned in the apocalyptic literature. And in this, they focus on this hadith that says if the black banners and the yellow banners meet in the center of al-Sham or Syria, the bowels of the earth will be better than its surface. Now, the original historical context of this, the yellow banners, had to actually do with the Berbers who were coming from North Africa. And they get folded into this Islamic apocalyptic tradition, but it's Berbers who were inspired by Kharijite preachers, and the Kharijites being some of the folks who persecuted the Shia. So it is somewhat of an irony that you have a number of Shia glomming onto the yellow flags as a symbol for what they are fighting for. The reason they're glomming onto the yellow flags is because they are the color of the flags of Hezbollah. So that's why they've attached themselves to it. So this is actually a statement made by a current member of parliament in Iran and who was also the former deputy intelligence minister. And he talks about this prophecy
And he says that it's obviously about the current conflict and that the black flags are the bad guys. It's Al-Qaeda, it's the Islamic State, and the good guys are fighting under the yellow banners. And that, of course, is Hezbollah. The Sunnis, they read it the exact opposite, of course, particularly if they're partisans of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. They see the black flags as the good guys, and the yellow flags they agree is Hezbollah, but of course that is bad. You may be asking yourselves, does this stuff really matter? I mean, it's a couple of folks just popping off on Twitter. Who cares? I think it matters quite a bit, actually. But it's not always easy to get to because you can't, it's not the easiest thing to interview people who are fighting there. But for some of the reporters who have gone and done the hard work and interviewed people going into Syria, a lot of them have said that this apocalyptic literature is the reason that they have gone. And it has inspired them to be there. So we'll go through some of these. If you're interested, if you just Google Apocalypse and Reuters, there's a great Reuters article on this. And then 2 days ago, David Kirkpatrick for the New York Times had a great article on Tunisia where he talks to a number of young men. You see this popping up as well. So these are the Sunnis that are quoted in that Reuters article. This one says, if you think all these mujahideen came from across the world to fight Assad, you're mistaken. They are all here as promised by the Prophet. This is the war he promised. This is the great battle. We have here mujahideen from Russia, America, the Philippines, China, Germany, Belgium, Sudan, India, and Yemen, and other places. They are here because this is what the Prophet said and promised. The grand battle is happening. These hadith are what the mujahideen are guided by to come to Syria. We are fighting for this. With every passing day, we know that we are living the days that the Prophet talked about. So this is on the Sunni side, right? And they're inspired by all of these apocalyptic traditions about the necessity of going to fight in Syria. On the flip side, the Shia, same. They feel that they are there to fight in the grand battle. And that they are in the right. Even if I am martyred now, when he, the Mahdi, appears, I will be reborn to fight among his army. I will be his soldier. Nothing's more precious than the Imam. It is our duty. The invasion of Iraq was the first sign in this apocalyptic drama, and then everything else followed. I was waiting for the day when I will fight in Syria. Thank God he chose me to be one of the Imam's soldiers. So both sides believe that they are fighting in this sectarian war as a lead up to the appearance of the Mahdi and the great battle with the infidel. So some observations before I open it up for questions. One is that it's important to know that obviously the identity of the apocalyptic actors changes over time, right? Who the Sufyani is or who the Antichrist is. It depends on the conflict. If you were going to go back to the 1990s, Saddam Hussein is the Sufyani for the Shia, right? And the Dajjal, the Antichrist, is George W. Bush. I mean, for many Americans, they think the same way. But now it's a completely different set of actors, right? Because the conflict has shifted, but the same framework is being laid on top of the conflict. And I want to argue that the constant turmoil in the region and the geographical specificity in these prophecies heightens the appeal of using them and this apocalyptic framework. I mean, if these prophecies were about India or the Philippines, they wouldn't resonate quite so much as prophecies that talk about al-Sham, Yemen, Iraq, which most of these do because that's the context they were born out of, which leads me to my second point. The sectarian readings of prophecies about the apocalypse are most attractive when those conflicts happen on sectarian fault lines that gave birth to the prophecies in the first place. So the fact that these early conflicts in Islam took place in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Fertile Crescent in the Levant, that's the reason why they resonate so strongly today. Those old sectarian fault lines are still there from the early conflicts, and the prophecies that arose out of those fault lines are still there. So it maps quite well.
And then finally, these apocalyptic frameworks can motivate action. They can drive people to go fight in conflicts they might otherwise ignore. Now, I'm not going to say that's the whole reason why people are going to fight in Syria. There's a lot of other reasons. It's geographically much easier to get to than some of the other conflicts. Social media today makes it much easier to connect, to go there. So there's other reasons. A lot of people going there aren't motivated necessarily by apocalyptic stuff. Some are going for adventure, some just like to mix it up and fight. I don't want to say this is everything, but it's something. A number of people going there have cited this as their primary motive for going to fight in Syria. I think just if you're interested in studying this stuff or looking at it more, Twitter and social media offer really new ways to get at this kind of thinking that we didn't have before. If you were to look at academic works on contemporary Muslim apocalyptic thinking, all of them are written prior to social media. And all of them had to rely on the professor's good luck in going to bookstores and finding interesting literature or encountering people who were handing out interesting pamphlets. These were often works that were written by folks who were kind of marginal to the religious establishment, but often were professionals, lawyers or engineers who were writing this stuff part-time. Today, it's really changed. It's become much more democratic in the sense that a lot more people are engaging in it, and you can find a lot of it just through social media. And it's in all strata. It's not just the masses. It's also religious scholars who, prior to this, especially among the Sunnis, really disdained to write about the end times because they considered that to be the sort of thing that the Shia do. Now a lot of Sunni religious scholars are getting involved as well, which I think is a testament to how overheated the situation is in the Middle East. Finally, I just want to finish with some comparisons between what I see today and the kind of apocalypticism you would see back in the 1990s and 2000s, because I think there have been some important changes. Number one is that the U.S. invasion of Iraq really drove a lot of new apocalyptic thinking in the region. Prior to the American invasion of Iraq, the focus was really on Israel as the prime actor in the apocalyptic drama. After the invasion, it was really seen as driven by the United States, the apocalyptic drama, and that the Jews in Israel were kind of a handmaid to the United States. So it shifts the focus. The focus has shifted again until recently. It was much more focused on hypocritical Muslims being the prime driver. A much more sectarian reading, obviously, because the conflict was more sectarian. The West wasn't really involved until recently. Now you have kind of a combination of the sectarian interpretation of the apocalypses and now reintroducing the so-called Christian Zionist crusader back into the mix. It's fascinating if you look at the jihadist movement, which is what I spent a lot of the last 10 years studying. You don't really find a lot of apocalyptic thinking in al-Qaeda, which is sort of interesting given how violent the group is, given its mission to restore the caliphate. Al-Qaeda really played this kind of thinking down. They would sometimes brandish the black flag, make allusions to armies coming from the east, but they didn't make a big deal out of it. And if anything, they really played down this kind of thinking. A lot of that is because the people at the top, bin Laden, Zawahiri, pretty urbane Sunnis, who, as I said, look down on this kind of thing as something that the masses do or that the Shia do. It's not something that we as Sunnis do. That's really changed. Not for al-Qaeda. The guys at the top, still the same way, but for the Islamic State, this splinter group has
always been quite apocalyptic, going back to its origins in 2004, 2005 as al-Qaeda in Iraq, and especially today. It has really played up this apocalyptic angle in its recruitment, in the symbols that it uses, the name of its periodical. It is very much at the fore of apocalyptic thinking in the jihadist movement. I guess I would say in closing that, to state the obvious, the longer that the conflict persists, in this region in particular, the more appealing apocalyptic frameworks will become. And eventually, as we're seeing today, this sort of thinking takes on a life of its own. It kind of transcends even the conflict and becomes a reason in itself for people to come and fight in the hopes that they can take part in the last great battle. So I'll end it there, and I'm happy to take your questions.